The Atlantic crossing was not a voyage, it was a descent into the unknown. German soldiers, stripped of their weapons, but not their pride, were herded into the steel bellies of Liberty ships. Official U.S. Army records described these transports as crowded but secure. Yet survivors would later recall them as suffocating dungeons at sea. Men lay shoulder to shoulder in the dark, the air thick with the stench of sweat and vomit. Seasickness became as common as breathing. Every creak of the hull reminded them they were captives now, their fates written not by Berlin, but by Washington. For many, fear was sharper than the salt wind. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for brutality. Leaflets distributed to Wehrmacht units warned that capture by Americans meant starvation, beatings, and labor until death. Some whispered that prisoners might be paraded through U.S. cities as trophies of war. Others muttered darker rumors that they would vanish into mines or fields, never to see Europe again. The voyage was a purgatory of speculation. And yet, as the ships approached the American coast, glimpses of a different reality began to appear. Through narrow vents and portholes, prisoners caught sight of bustling harbors, New York, Boston, Norfolk alive with cranes, rail yards, and skyscrapers still untouched by the devastation of war. To men accustomed to the ruins of Hamburg or Cologne, America looked impossibly intact, almost surreal. One recalled later, "We expected to see a land of hunger and fear. Instead, it was as though the war had not touched them at all." The shock deepened inland. Prisoners were marched not into pits or cages, but onto trains bound for the interior of the United States. Their destinations were not torture camps, but military installations repurposed into sprawling compounds. Barbed wire? Yes, but behind it, orderly rows of wooden barracks. Inside, bunks stacked neatly, mess halls, even libraries. In some camps, German prisoners discovered sports fields, chapel services, and rations that by 1944 often surpassed what civilians in Germany could dream of eating. Pork, potatoes, even coffee. It was bewildering. These were supposed to be the enemy's prisons, yet they resembled a strange kind of village. The generosity sparked suspicion. Were the Americans softening them for propaganda, fattening them like animals before slaughter? In barracks across the Midwest and South, whispers multiplied. Veterans cautioned the younger men, "Do not trust this. It is a trick." But the real revelation was yet to come. In processing halls, officers delivered a set of rules with clinical precision. Prisoners would work, they would obey, and they would remain confined. But then came a phrase that shattered expectations. Each prisoner, they were told, was permitted to write letters to full letters and for postcards a month home to Germany. The announcement was met with stunned silence. Some laughed bitterly, convinced it was a psychological ploy. Others stared as though they had misheard. Letters to families in the Reich. It was unthinkable. Even in Hitler's Germany, correspondence had been slow, censored, and controlled. And here across the ocean, in the hands of the enemy, they were being offered the chance to reach across the abyss of war. Skepticism prevailed. Surely the letters would never arrive. Surely they would be censored into meaninglessness, or used to manipulate their families. But the rules were unmistakable. No propaganda, no military secrets, only personal words. The International Red Cross would handle the mail. The men filed back to their barracks that night, minds racing. Barbed wire still encircled them, the war still raged. Yet somewhere, in the silence of captivity, a door had been cracked open not through food or shelter, but through the promise of words. Could paper and ink truly travel farther than guns and bombs? Could a captive's voice slip past oceans, censors, and empires to reach the heart of home? For the German prisoners, disbelief weighed heavier than hope. But soon, their pencils would test the impossible. The first glimpse of the camps was designed to intimidate. Military reports described them as standardized compounds, but to the men stepping off the trains, they looked like prisons carved into the American landscape. Rows of barbed wire stretched across the horizon, punctuated by wooden guard towers where sentries stood with rifles at the ready. Spotlights swept the ground at night, casting long shadows across the earth. For German prisoners accustomed to the chaos of war, the sheer order of these enclosures was unnerving. Upon arrival, the process began with military precision. Each prisoner was lined up, his name recorded in thick ledger books, his serial number logged. Belongings were confiscated, pockets emptied, and Wehrmacht uniforms stripped away. In their place came coarse denim work clothes stenciled with the letters PW, prisoner of war. The transformation was psychological as much as physical. In a matter of hours, men who had once marched under swastika banners now found themselves catalogued and anonymized, their identities reduced to numbers. And then, without ceremony, the announcement came. Camp officials explained the rules of captivity. Prisoners would be housed in barracks, provided meals, and assigned labor in accordance with the Geneva Convention. But the detail that silenced the assembly was this: each man was permitted to write home, to letters and for postcards per month, all routed through the International Red Cross. At first, the reaction was disbelief. In the barracks, men muttered that it was a cruel American trick. Letters, after all, were a privilege of the free, not of the conquered. One veteran laughed bitterly, spitting the words, "Letters. From prison, they want to make fools of us." For soldiers raised under the Third Reich, where even civilian correspondence was delayed, censored, and often withheld, the idea seemed impossible. How could their enemy allow them a voice? The rules were explained with clinical precision. Nothing about troop movements, no political messages, no propaganda, only family matters, personal words. Any violation, they were warned, would see the letter blacked out or destroyed. The Red Cross would ensure delivery. In the silence that followed, suspicion rippled through the barracks like a current. Could the Americans be manipulating them? Would their words be intercepted, twisted, or even used against their families? For hardened veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front or in Normandy, the offer smelled of psychological warfare. They warned their younger comrades, "Don't trust the paper. Don't trust the enemy's mercy." And yet, temptation gnawed at them. The youngest prisoners, farm boys from Bavaria, apprentices from the Rhineland, students pulled too soon into the war, could not ignore the possibility. Some had not seen their families in years. Others had wives expecting children, mothers waiting anxiously, fathers lost in bombed-out cities. The chance to write, even if censored, was too powerful to dismiss. That night, the barracks were restless. Men lay awake on their bunks, staring at the wooden ceilings, imagining sentences that might one day cross an ocean. Some rehearsed greetings in their minds. Others cursed the offer, unwilling to believe it was real. But one thing was certain: the silence of captivity had been fractured. The Americans had not broken them with rifles or chains. They had unsettled them with something far more fragile: a sheet of paper, a pencil, and the promise of connection. Could the enemy truly allow their voices to reach across the seas? Or was this merely another battlefield, one fought not with bullets, but with words? The question would haunt every man who picked up a pencil in the days to come. The order came on an ordinary morning, but for the prisoners, it felt like something extraordinary. The mess hall, normally a place of noise, clattering tin trays, and routine, had been transformed. Long wooden tables stood in precise rows, stripped bare of food and utensils. Instead, each place was set with a thin sheet of stationery stamped by the International Red Cross, a dull gray pencil cut short from overuse, and a pre-printed envelope bearing the words "Prisoner of War Mail." Eyewitness accounts described the atmosphere as reverent, almost religious. Men shuffled forward in lines, their boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. Some received the paper with trembling hands, as though it were contraband smuggled across enemy lines. For others, it seemed a cruel joke, freedom offered on a sheet of paper no bigger than their palm. The silence that followed was suffocating. Hundreds of men sat staring at the blank page, each suddenly confronted with a burden heavier than any weapon they had carried. What words were safe? What if a phrase, misunderstood, endangered their loved ones back home? Under Nazi rule, even civilian correspondence had been monitored and censored. Now, riding under the eyes of their captors, the stakes felt even higher. Some prisoners could only manage the simplest phrases: "I am alive," "I am treated well," "Do not worry." These words were repeated across the hall, sterile assurances that concealed oceans of unspoken emotion. Others hesitated for long minutes, their pencils hovering above the paper, as if each sentence were a minefield. One Bavarian farm boy, barely 20, finally pressed his pencil to the page. "Dearest mother, I am alive." His handwriting faltered, the letters uneven from the shaking of his hand. In another corner, a soldier captured in Normandy struggled to find words for his wife, who was expecting their first child. He started and stopped, tearing the paper in frustration, haunted by the thought that he might never meet the life she carried. The soundscape of the hall was unforgettable: scratches of graphite on paper, muffled sobs stifled into sleeves, the soft rip of pages discarded and begun again. A few men broke down entirely, staring blankly at the paper as if the act of writing were too painful to attempt. For them, silence felt safer than risking words. Once written, the letters passed into the machinery of war. Camp clerks gathered them in heavy canvas sacks, carrying them to censors who inspected every line. Black ink slashed across forbidden phrases, mentions of troop movements, political commentary, or despairing criticisms. Yet, to the prisoners' astonishment, most of their words remained intact. The censors, efficient but restrained, seemed intent not on silencing, but on pruning. And then, in a moment as surreal as it was anticlimactic, the letters vanished. Loaded onto trucks, they disappeared through the camp gates, bound for postal routes that stretched across oceans. The prisoners watched, their eyes fixed on the departing vehicles as though staring at pieces of their own souls being carried away. Disbelief lingered. Would these envelopes truly survive the gauntlet of censors, Red Cross officials, and transatlantic shipping lanes? Would their mothers, wives, and children ever hold these fragile scraps of paper in their hands? Or would they vanish, like so many promises of war, into oblivion? That night, the barracks buzzed with uneasy hope. Men replayed the sentences they had written, wondering if they had chosen the right words. Suspicion remained, but it was no longer unchallenged. For the first time since their capture, a thin thread of connection stretched between captivity and home. If it was a trick, it was a dangerous one, for it had given the prisoners something no guard tower or barbed wire could fully contain: the first flicker of hope. Sealed in their thin envelopes, the prisoners' letters began a second captivity, a journey across a world at war. What left their hands in neat stacks within the camp mess hall now entered the labyrinth of wartime bureaucracy, where every word was tested, weighed, and judged. The first stop was the American military postal centers. Here, under bright lamps and the sharp gaze of intelligence officers, censors combed through each line. They searched for invisible ink, coded language, or even the suspicious placement of a comma. Manuals distributed to censors listed dozens of possible tricks. References to weather could signal troop locations. A seemingly harmless phrase might conceal intelligence. Yet, despite the scrutiny, most letters survived, carrying forward their fragile words of reassurance. From there, sacks of mail were bundled under the watch of the International Red Cross. Neutral and untouchable, the organization became the conduit of human emotion during the most mechanized of wars. Trucks carried the letters to ports in Boston and New York, where they were loaded onto ships bound for Europe. Each crossing was itself an ordeal. The Atlantic, bristling with German U-boats, had become a graveyard of merchant vessels. Somewhere in those convoys, among crates of ammunition and sacks of flour, were the letters of captured German soldiers, letters more dangerous to the Reich than bullets, because they carried a truth unshaped by propaganda. The destination was not Germany itself, but neutral sanctuaries. Switzerland and Sweden became sorting grounds, where Red Cross clerks handled millions of envelopes destined for both Allied and Axis families. From Geneva, mail was funneled into the collapsing veins of the Reich's postal service, delivered by weary postmen navigating bombed-out streets, cities reduced to rubble, and towns where entire neighborhoods no longer existed. For prisoners still behind barbed wire, the journey of their letters was a subject of constant rumor. In the barracks, men whispered theories. Some swore the Americans burned the letters as a cruel trick. Others insisted they knew the precise route through Lisbon, Geneva, or Stockholm. A few optimists claimed the Red Cross itself guaranteed their safe passage, citing Geneva Convention provisions as proof. The truth lay somewhere between law, logistics, and luck. And yet, the system worked more often than it failed. Weeks stretched into months, but the words did reach their destinations. In bombed-out German apartments, women clutching ration cards found thin envelopes in their mail slots. Mothers held trembling hands to their mouths as they recognized the handwriting of sons they had presumed dead. Wives broke down, clutching letters that bore only a few sterile sentences, yet carried the weight of survival. To the Americans, this was routine, a bureaucratic necessity, one cog in the massive machinery of war. But to the prisoners, each letter was a miracle, a fragile bridge of ink and paper that spanned oceans, borders, and the iron grip of ideology. Imagine it, words scratched in pencil inside a barbed wire compound in Texas or Pennsylvania passing through the hands of military officers, Red Cross officials, port workers, and ship captains until finally in a ruined German city, a child unfolded the paper and whispered, "Father is alive." The Atlantic had swallowed countless lives, but against all odds, it carried something else as well, hope, packed into envelopes that weighed less than an ounce, yet bore the gravity of survival itself. And back in the camps, men waited, counting days, wondering if their voices had crossed the sea or vanished into silence. The morning began like any other roll call, the rattle of tin cups, the routine of captivity. But then, something extraordinary happened. Guards entered the camp carrying heavy burlap sacks. They weren't filled with rations, or uniforms, or orders. They were filled with envelopes, thousands of them, each one stamped with German postmarks. Prisoners froze, their eyes fixed on the impossible sight. Names were called out, one after another, echoing across the yard. Men stepped forward hesitantly, trembling as sheets of thin paper were pressed into their hands. Familiar handwriting stared back at them, curves and strokes that no censor, no soldier, no stranger could ever forge. For the first time, captivity bent under the weight of something powerful, the voices of home. The reactions were raw, unguarded. Some men clutched their letters to their chests, unable to break the seal, as if opening them might shatter the fragile miracle. Others ripped them apart instantly, devouring each line in frantic silence. A soldier from Hamburg collapsed onto his bunk after reading his wife's words. Their home was gone, destroyed in an air raid, but she was alive. Another man, stoic and unflinching since his capture, wept openly at the news of his father's death. The letters carried contradictions, joy and devastation intertwined. They were proof that life beyond the wire endured, but also reminders of war's unrelenting cruelty. Bombings, hunger, separation, whole worlds of suffering and survival poured across fragile sheets. Yet even grief became a kind of connection. For the first time, these men were part of their family's stories again. The barracks transformed, conversation shifted from rumors of distant battles to tales from home. Laughter broke out over a child's scribbled drawing, passed from hand to hand. Passages from wives were read aloud, while others sat in silence, staring at a single sentence until it blurred with tears. Hardened soldiers softened, clutching envelopes like sacred relics. And a paradox lingered. The Americans, the enemy, had made this lifeline possible. Against expectation, the letters had not vanished into the Atlantic, they had crossed the ocean, and now, impossibly, they had returned. The ritual began with the sound, the scrape of boots across gravel, the rattle of keys at the guardhouse, and finally, the sight of burlap sacks slung over American shoulders. On mail day, every prisoner knew what was coming. Hearts pounded as guards stepped into the yard, their voices sharp, carrying names across the compound. Some men received multiple envelopes at once, clutching them with relief and disbelief. Others stood silent, their names never called, faces drawn with disappointment that deepened with each passing week. Yet even those left empty-handed gathered close to the lucky ones. They listened as letters were read aloud, pretending, if only for a few minutes, that the words belonged to them too. The effect was immediate, visible, where once the camp had echoed with silence, suspicion, and simmering hostility. Now it buzzed with fragments of memory. Men compared childhood stories, retold family jokes, and laughed at the antics described in their children's scribbles. Fragile sheets of paper were read until they frayed, passed from hand to hand like relics of a forgotten world. For the American guards, this was merely procedure. Geneva Convention obligations, carried out with bureaucratic detachment. But for the prisoners, the letters became lifelines. Psychologists would later record that correspondence eased despair, blunted defiance, even reduced escape attempts. Hope, carefully folded into envelopes, made survival seem possible, and beyond the statistics were moments of piercing humanity. A father wept as he read of a newborn child he had never seen. A young man, hardened by battle, smiled for the first time in captivity when he learned his younger brother had stolen his bicycle. These details, so ordinary, so small, became miracles behind the wire. Captivity remained. Barbed fences still cut the horizon, towers still watched from above. But something fundamental had shifted. Where despair once ruled, connection now bloomed. Hope, once dangerous, had become a daily companion. The sacks of mail had transformed the camps, but not every man believed. In the dim barracks, where whispers carried further than shouts, suspicion clung like smoke. Among officers and hardened veterans, doubt remained unshaken. They muttered that the Americans allowed letters not out of kindness, but as a weapon designed to soften resolve, to rot loyalty from within. Some went further, claiming that every envelope was forged, every word rewritten by allied censors to manipulate their thoughts. And yet, the paper told another story. A man stared at the looping script of his mother's hand, unmistakable from a lifetime of notes tucked into school books. Another found his wife's familiar misspellings, errors no foreigner could have faked. Childhood nicknames, private jokes, the intimate rhythm of family speech, these details were too precise, too authentic. Slowly, authenticity cracked the narrative of fabrication. Still, habits of propaganda die hard. German officers urged vigilance, repeating warnings against falling for American tricks. Discipline was demanded. Suspicion elevated to duty, but cracks widened in silence. A soldier whose wife wrote that she prayed for him daily struggled to reconcile that tenderness with orders to despise his captors. Another, learning his children had survived a bombing, felt a flicker of gratitude he dared not confess aloud. The Americans, intriguingly, did not exploit the system crudely. Censors blotted out forbidden phrases, but they did not rewrite words, nor insert propaganda. The letters were left intact, and it was this very honesty that disoriented the prisoners most. For men raised under a regime where truth was rationed, the rawness of unaltered words was almost unthinkable. In the flicker of barracks lamps, debates raged deep into the night. Was this a gesture of humanity, or the most subtle strategy of all? For many, the answer mattered less than the result. The connection was real. Suspicion lingered, but hope, quiet, stubborn, and uninvited, was winning. The official records of the U.S. Army camps describe a curious phenomenon. Where once there had been fights, sulking silences, and escape attempts, discipline seemed to improve almost overnight. The reason was not stricter guards or harsher rules, it was paper. Folded, ink-stained sheets traveling across oceans, carrying fragments of distant lives, had reshaped the very air inside the camps. In the dim barracks, men once broken by monotony now clutched envelopes like treasures. A father who had resigned himself to never seeing his family again now dreamed of walking his children to school. Another, whose wife described the smell of their harvest back home, found new resolve in imagining the soil beneath his boots. Where despair had gnawed at the edges of sanity, letters planted seeds of future farms to rebuild, businesses to reopen, studies to continue. But the letters did more than restore individuals, they bound the prisoners together. Those without mail gathered to listen as others read aloud. A man's joy at his child's scribbled note became the barrack's joy. Another's grief at news of a lost parent became grief shared by all. In these moments, captivity ceased to be solitary punishment, it became community, forged in words carried across seas. The Americans watched in silence. Reports noted fewer quarrels, fewer punishments, fewer attempts to dig tunnels beneath the wire. Guards quickly realized that correspondence was not just morale, it was survival. The rhythm of mail day gave time meaning, a heartbeat in captivity that echoed from one week to the next. And slowly, something deeper shifted. Prisoners who had once spat at the sight of their captors now nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Gratitude was rarely spoken, it would have sounded like betrayal, but it was there, heavy in the air. For the first time, doubt cracked the iron shell of Nazi propaganda. How could America be the monstrous land of lies and cruelty, as the Reich had insisted, when it allowed them to hold their children's words in their hands? In the stillness of night, men reread fading ink until the paper nearly tore, clinging to each line as if it could bridge the barbed wire. What the regime had failed to destroy, simple correspondence had revived. Hearts, stretched across an ocean, were reconnected, and in that fragile reconnection lay something more dangerous to totalitarianism than bombs or bullets, the quiet rediscovery of humanity. When former German prisoners of war were asked, decades later, what memory of captivity clung to them most, their answers were rarely about barbed wire or guard towers. It was the letters. Fragile, creased, and smudged with the sweat of anxious hands, these were described as talismans, proof that in a world determined to strip men of their identity, they still belonged to someone beyond the fence. For some, the letters were radiant with joy. Wives who promised to wait, mothers who filled pages with prayers, children who grew up knowing their fathers lived, even if they were absent. For others, the envelopes carried shadows, news of bombed cities, vanished relatives, or the finality of death. Yet even grief was treasured. In an age when propaganda and rumor reigned, the unfiltered truth of ink on paper was a kind of liberation. Historians later noted how the American policy of permitting correspondence fulfilled the Geneva Convention's promise. But the impact ran deeper than legal compliance. Camps stabilized, violence ebbed, and for many Germans, the first fractures in Nazi ideology appeared not on the battlefield, but in those envelopes. How could the enemy be the barbarian their leaders described, when that very enemy allowed their children's words to reach them intact? Families, too, bore the legacy. Across Germany, households preserved those fragile sheets like relics, tucked into drawers, pressed between Bible pages. When prisoners finally returned home, many found their families had endured because of those scraps of paper. The correspondence had become a bridge not just between captor and captive, but between survival and memory itself. The legacy of words lingered long after the war ended. For those who lived it, the miracle of letters proved that even in humanity's darkest chapters, compassion could slip quietly through the cracks of barbed wire. Official records of the Second World War detail the movements of armies, the destruction of cities, and the staggering death toll. Yet tucked into archives and memoirs lies a quieter testimony. Thousands of letters that crossed oceans, slipping past the barbed wire of American prisoner of war camps. For the men who received them, these fragile envelopes mattered more than rations or blankets. They were, as many later described, the true currency of survival. The letters did not erase captivity. Hunger remained, freedom was still distant, and the war dragged on. But they redefined what imprisonment could mean. A man who days earlier was just a number in a roll call became, through a few lines in familiar handwriting, once again a father, a husband, a son. Historians note that this subtle restoration of identity weakened the hold of Nazi propaganda more effectively than threats or punishments ever could. Some former prisoners admitted that the first time they held a reply from home was the moment they began to believe survival was possible. Others confessed it was the first time they questioned the Reich they had served. How could a nation portrayed as monstrous allow such a gift? The simple act of correspondence carried more power than any weapon. The miracle outlasted the war. Families stored those brittle pages like relics. Former prisoners, decades later, could still recite lines from memory. In the darkest years of conflict, when cruelty seemed inevitable, the freedom to write and be heard became a beacon of humanity. And for the German soldiers who once scoffed at the idea that mail could reach them in captivity remained the one gift of America. They never forgot a miracle etched in pencil carried across oceans and remembered for a lifetime.